Now, to introduce our speaker this evening, I'm going to tell a little story. And this story may not make any sense on how it relates to our speaker, but somehow I'll make a loose connection. I don't know, I was I'd say about 8, 10 years old, somewhere in that range, and my buddies and I decided we were going to put together a pickup game of baseball across the street at St. Mary's Catholic Church, where I went to school and church out in the field. Well, we were short one player. And so Chris lived just like 2 houses down, so we all ran over to Chris's house and just started screaming, "Chris, come out, come out, come out." Well, little did we know that his uncle had gotten to town at 2 o'clock in the morning the night before. And they were trying to let him sleep. And his mom came out on the front porch, and she was not too happy. And I say that because, of course, I was not always the angel, nor am I an angel now. But his uncle, well, Chris's last name was Kroll. And his uncle was Cardinal Kroll, as in Archdiocese of Philadelphia, Cardinal Kroll. And he had come to visit his nephew and his brother and his wife's family. So we got in trouble for waking Cardinal Kroll up. But I say that because Cardinal Kroll ordained our speaker tonight. And so without further ado, I'd like to proudly introduce the 8th Bishop of the Diocese of Toledo, Bishop Daniel Thomas.
Thank you so much to Father Keith, and I can tell you I had a great affection for Cardinal Kroll, and you probably know that story of the piece of art that was handed on from Bishop Schrems to Bishop Hoban to Bishop Kroll to Archbishop Foley and then to me, and unbeknownst that it started with the first Bishop of Toledo, and now it's in the possession of the 8th Bishop of Toledo. So it's found its way back to Ohio, thank God. What a joy to be with all of you this evening as we celebrate the Catholic sacrament of marriage. And of course, this year, I'm sure that for some, this annual celebration becomes even more significant since it falls on Valentine's Day. And I know that's why the crowd this year is so huge. I've been asked to speak to you about holy matrimony. I was told by Deacon Joe Malenfant that I had complete latitude and longitude in choosing what I would speak about. I have to tell you that he also told me I could speak as long as I wanted to. You never tell a bishop that. So this evening, while you've had speakers in the past who've considered various aspects of marriage, I thought this speaker would perhaps present, rather than a spiritual talk on the spirituality of marriage, rather than a theological talk on the theology of the body, perhaps, or the complementarity of husband and wife, rather than a biblical reflection, instead, I would like to offer to you my reflections this evening on my understanding of marriage as it was given to me through my experience of the marriage of my mom and dad. It was they who, living out their married life as husband and wife and as parents, taught me firsthand what Catholic Christian marriage meant and is. My mother, Anna, and my father, Francis, have both gone to the Lord. And they would both no doubt require that I offer this disclaimer. First, they would be painfully embarrassed that I was speaking about them, and they forbade me to do so in life. But now I can do it. The second disclaimer is they would say they were far from saints. Be that as it may, the love they shared just over 51 years of marriage before my mother's death, and the love that they taught me and my brother was more than any spiritual, theological, or biblical lecture I have ever learned. So this evening, I'd simply like to share with you stories and impressions about the married love of my parents, and in that, offer the simple lesson, I hope, of what I believe their love reveals about married Catholic love. So to begin, because my mother would always say you always have to begin with sacred scripture, to begin, permit me to focus our reflection with the words of St. Paul. And you'll be very familiar with these words. They are perhaps, all priests and deacons know, probably the most chosen text for the celebration of weddings. It's the reading from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. These are St. Paul's words. If I speak in human and angelic tongues, but do not have love, I am a resounding gong or a clashing cymbal. And if I have the gift of prophecy and comprehend all mysteries and all knowledge, if I have all faith so as to move mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give away everything I own, if I hand my body over so that I may boast but do not have love, I gain nothing. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not jealous. Love is not pompous. It is not inflated. Love does not seek its own interests. It is not rude. It is not quick-tempered. It does not brood over injury. It does not rejoice over wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things. Faith, hope, and love remain, these three, but the greatest of these is love. So what I thought I would do is simply share with you hallmarks, if you will, or characteristics, having reflected on the love that St. Paul speaks of, and compare the course of the love that my mom and dad shared as husband and wife, which is, in effect, the love of every Catholic marriage, the love which reflects the love of Christ Jesus for his bride, the church. So permit me then to offer these hallmarks of their marriage so that you might consider them and reflect on them regarding your own married love. First, Catholic. Imagine that. When my mom and dad were engaged, it was Christmas Eve. And my father took a little box in his pocket, and they went to midnight mass. And before the mass began, they knelt before the manger, and my father took out of his pocket a little box, and he opened it, and he slid it across the altar rail as they knelt in front of the nativity scene. And my mother looked down. He said nothing. She looked up at him. He had a tear in his eye. She then had a tear in her eye. He said nothing. And she said yes. Now that's Catholic, right? When my mom and dad were celebrating their anniversaries, 25, 40 years, 50 years, I first sat down with them. I had already been ordained a priest when they were 50 years, but not at 25 years. I was a seminarian. So I sat down with them thinking, I'll have the whole liturgy planned out and I'm going to ask them what they want to do. And then I'll ask them when they want to renew their vows. Now, this is no offense meant to the people who stood up and did that in church. I asked my parents, when do you want to renew your vows? Dead silence. And they looked at me, and my mother said, Dad, why don't you tell him? And my father looked at me and he said, we're not going to renew our vows. I said, everybody renews their vows. What are you talking about? They said, no, honey, we're not going to renew our vows. I said, why not? My father said, we respect the people who renew their vows, but we're not going to do it. I said, why not? I know Mom's embarrassed to get up in front of a crowd. She said, that's not the reason. And then my father said, we're not going to renew our vows because we prayed about it and thought about it, and this is our answer. We said our vows once, we meant it then, we mean it now, and we renew them every time we wake up in the same bed together. Now that's Catholic. So, that was them. But what makes your marriage Catholic? What makes it uniquely Catholic? And the Catholic that is marriage is the sacrifice that Christ offered for his church, and the sacrifice of a bride and a groom for each other as they lay down their lives out of love for each other. Second, prayerful. Their marriage was extraordinarily prayerful. From my first memory as a child, I remember going into their room, and when they would get ready for bed at night, every single night until I left their home, every single night, on their knees, at their bedside, praying their night prayers before going to bed. They were extraordinarily prayerful, not just each one, but together, and kneeling by the bedside, praying night prayers before going to bed. And when they woke up in the morning, they got out of their bed and knelt down together. Even when they struggled physically, and even when they couldn't struggle to get out of bed anymore, morning prayers and night prayers. Prayerful. They taught my brother and me to pray by doing just that, getting on our knees by our bedside. And they taught us that Sunday Mass and daily Mass later in their lives should be the center, because Mass was the greatest prayer of all. Prayerful. How prayerful is your marriage? The Lord desires that prayer be at the heart, and that the Eucharist be that heart. Forgiving. When my parents were about 25 years married, as they prepared, a lot of couples at that time were doing marriage encounter, which some of you may have done or some of you may be familiar with. And at that time, people tried to encourage my parents to do it. So they went on a marriage encounter weekend. When they returned from it, my brother and I, who were high school age, and you know that age, right? So we wanted to know, what did they learn on their marriage encounter? And the first thing my dad, who had a great Irish sense of humor, said was, they taught us how to fight. And my brother and I said, what does that mean? Because we basically didn't see my parents fight. And my mom said, they taught us that if we have disagreements or we are going to argue or if it's leading to a fight, we should hold hands. And we said, really? And they said, yes. They told us if we have any disagreement, it's pretty hard if you're holding hands and looking into each other's eyes for the disagreement to last for any length of time. Forgiving, holding hands, and forgiving one another, no matter the disagreement. Isn't every Catholic marriage called to be forgiving as Christ was on the cross, forgiving each one of us out of love? Next, their love was evident. So what does that mean? My dad was Irish after all, so Irish people don't show affection very often, right? But their love was evident. Evident insofar as their affection and love were at once symbolic and nurturing. We know that the single act of a kiss is symbolic of the love it represents and nurturing of the love between husband and wife. My mom and dad would never leave the house without kissing one another and without the words, "I love you." Never left the house. And there were some days when my dad was out to work and 6 steps down the steps, when he'd climb the steps and come in the door again and look at my mother and say, "We forgot something." And they would kiss and say to one another, "I love you." Lots of folks used to say to my parents, "It's so beautiful that you hold hands." Now, you know that old line, when young couples are engaged, they're sitting on each other's laps in the car. When they're 1 year married, they're sitting next to each other. When they're 5 years married, they're sitting in the seats of the cars. And when they're 10 years married, she's in the back seat. Not true, of course. My parents often held hands. When I was a teenager, I would think, they look like little kids in love walking down the mall. When they would go out for a walk in the snow, they held hands. When I was ordained a priest, a number of priests commented, as you were on the floor being ordained, they were holding hands. There was something symbolic of their love and nurturing of their love in that daily kiss and in their holding hands. As married couples, your love is symbolized and nurtured with each kiss and with every holding of hands. Next, selfless. When we would look over pictures of when we were little boys, my brother and me, we would look especially at these Easter pictures, and in so many of the Easter pictures, year after year after year, here are my brother and I in all sorts of different snazzy little outfits, and my mother in the same suit and hat. And I remember after we grew older, we would say, "Mom, why are we so dressed up? But it seems almost every year you're in the same thing." And she would say to us, "Oh, it was more important for you to have something new." My dad worked 3 jobs when we were young because he wanted to be able to give us a Catholic education. He wanted to be able to give us 1 week of vacation at the beach, and he wanted to allow my mom to stay home and be a stay-home mom so that she could be the example that they desired the mother would be in the home. Selfless. The Lord desires your marriage each day to be selfless. You know that corny line at weddings that you hear from corny homilists like me? The word wedding, in the word wedding, we comes before I. Selfless. That's Catholic. Next, unafraid. Now this is going to be a little tough. Are you ready? When I was hit by a religious sister in grade school, after having done nothing because 2 kids in front of me acted out, but she thought it was me, and slapped me on one side and down the other, God forbid, and I love religious sisters. I did not love this religious sister. I went home and I told my mother, and my mother said, "What did you do?" And I told her I did nothing. She said, "Are you telling the truth?" I said, "Yes, Mother, I am." She said, "Put your coat on." And down we went to the school, and right in we went to the sister, and my mother gave Sister a piece of her mind. And Sister apologized. My mother was not afraid, and there was no one that respected religious women like my mother. My dad, who was a lector for 35 years in our parish, began the first reading one Sunday when the angry pastor grumbled and mumbled and was coughing and choking as if something were wrong. But my dad went right through with the readings, and after Mass, the pastor berated my father angrily and screamed at him in the sacristy for doing the wrong readings. My father graciously said, "Father, you're incorrect. I did the right readings, and you are wrong." My father left the sacristy. A week later, the priest wrote a note apologizing to my father for his outburst because my father was right. There was nobody who respected priests more than my father, but he was not afraid to tell the truth. He was unafraid to do the right thing. True married love is unafraid. Their love was devoted. One time I remember my mother on the phone, and it seemed she was rather perplexed. I was home from the seminary, and she was on, I knew, with her brother, my Uncle Charles. And when she got off the phone, she looked a little taken aback. And my dad and I were there with my brother, and I said, "Mother, what was that all about?" And she said, "Well, your Uncle Charles said that he had something to tell me, but that he didn't want me to tell anybody else." And apparently my mother told my Uncle Charles, "Well, if I can't tell Fran, my husband, then don't bother telling me." And my Uncle Charles did not tell her. But because she didn't hold anything back from my father, she even told her brother, "Don't bother telling me a secret that I can't tell my husband." My dad would tell the story of when they were very young and married, they went to a trusted priest because they were having difficulty dealing with my dad's mother, my grandma. They were having difficulty because they felt she was being overbearing, and she was being too much and demanding too much. Both of my mother's parents died when I was 1 year old. The priest told my dad he had to choose between his wife and his mother. And he told my dad, "You married your wife. You have to respect your mother, but now you're a married man." My dad apparently went home and told his mother in no uncertain terms he was adult and he loved her, but she was not going to control his life. So devoted were they to each other, they held nothing from one another, and they allowed no one to interfere in their love. Isn't married love the devoted love that permits no one to interfere in it and allows no one a secret? Their love was unconditional. My brother, from the time he began working, was very disgruntled because my parents said, "If you're going to live in our house and you're working, you're going to pay rent." I can't imagine any parents doing that here, right? So they said, "You're going to pay rent." Well, he grumbled and mumbled, and they demanded part of his check would go toward them as rent. What my brother didn't know was that their love was so unconditional that they put every check he gave them away in a bank account, and when he was married, they gave the entire thing to him as part of their wedding gift. Right before my own priestly ordination, I stepped out of the car, and the tradition in Philadelphia was that your parents, if you had them, drove you to the cathedral. We arrived, and my parents got out of the car, and I remember there was misty rain, and they hugged me, and my father and mother stood back, and my mother said, "Your father has one last thing to say before you go up that aisle." And with tears in their eyes, my father looked at me and he said, "We love you with all our being, and we want you to know that if you don't want to do this, if this is not correct, and if you are in any way afraid, you can get back in the car and we'll drive away and we won't ask any questions. But if you do go up the aisle and you become a priest of Christ and his church, then love them completely and never disgrace your family or the church." That was the kind of loving freedom they gave to me. Unconditional love. Love which is married love and ultimately Catholic love that does never count the cost and unconditionally offers itself to the other. Their love was humble. After many years as the younger son of only 2, it seemed to me that every single time that we fought and argued as brothers, I know you can't imagine that, but it is true, whenever we fought as brothers, it always seemed to me that my dad took my brother's side. It always seemed that every argument, my dad would come in and say, obviously it was my fault, because my brother was older and he knew better, and of course, my dad would trust my brother. I always wondered about that. And when I turned 21, my dad sat me down and he said, "You know what? I want to apologize for something." I said, "What's that, Dad?" He said, "I want to apologize." He said, "Because you know what? Every time you and your brother fought, I always took your brother's side." And he said, "Now I realize that was probably wrong at least half the time." He said, "So I want to apologize because you know what? Probably, you were probably right half the time. And I love you." Once when my mother was thinking that she had scolded me too harshly, she told me she was sorry for scolding me. And then she said, "But scolding you hurts me more than it hurts you." I think I was 13. And then she said, "You know, sometimes I wonder whether I love you too much." My parents couldn't possibly have loved me too much because their love was deeply humble. Isn't married love humble? Isn't parental love humble? Even to the point of admitting fault, saying "I'm sorry," and asking forgiveness. My parents' love was radically united. After my mother had had a massive stroke, which left her completely paralyzed on one side of her body, unable to eat or drink with a feeding tube, and sent to a high-skilled care nursing home, my father was nearby in another section of the nursing home, and after 1 week in the home, one night she called him to her bedside, and she said, "Dear, I have 3 questions." And holding hands, she asked him first, "Honey, will I ever get better?" And my father said, "Dear, I don't think you will." She said, "Will I ever eat or drink again?" And my father said, "The doctors don't think you will." And she then looked at my father and she said, "Will I ever get in bed to sleep next to you again?" And my father said, "I don't think that would ever be possible." And she died the next morning. After her death, my father went to a nursing home, and before he did, my brother and I asked him, "Dad, we would like to be able to place you in a Catholic nursing home if possible. And my father said, that would be my first preference. He said, because I would like to do three things. First, I'd like to go to Mass every day and receive the Holy Eucharist. Second, I'd like to be able to sit in front of the tabernacle and pray to Jesus. And third, while I'm there praying to Jesus, I'd like to be able to remember your mother, next to whom I received the Eucharist so many days of my life. Radically united in life and even in death. Isn't that the kind of unity that Catholic marriage is? And in the end, whether in life or in death, united in a love that never ends. I hope you don't mind these reflections, so intimately personal, but I felt the best way that I could let you know how I came to understand what a real Catholic marriage is. I hope that for each of your marriages, each of these points might be a point of reflection for you to strengthen your own marriage by grace and by the Lord's goodness, so that your marriage might be Catholic, your marriage might be prayerful, your marriage might be forgiving, your marriage might show evident love, your marriage might be selfless, your marriage might be unafraid, your marriage might be devoted, your marriage might be unconditional in love, your marriage might be humble, and your marriage might be radically united. When my mom and dad celebrated their 50th anniversary, my mom's health was not well enough in order to get out to get a gift. So who does she turn to? Her priest son. So she said, honey, without letting your father know, could you go out and get something very special for your dad from me? I said, Mom, what do you think? What would you like? And she said, he would be delighted with a really special pair of cufflinks. I said, how much do you want to spend? And I went to a little jeweler nearby, and there were nothing really special. And I asked the jeweler to engrave a T on them. And my mom gave those cufflinks to my dad for their 50th wedding anniversary. They were 51 years married when she died. I'm wearing those cufflinks tonight. And I wore them because of this celebration of marriage, and because I wanted to remember them, since I'm now married to you. Because every bishop on his ordination day receives a ring, and that ring symbolizes his love for the church to whom he is wed. What a gift to be wed to Toledo. Listen again to the inspiring words that St. Paul speaks about what love means. If I speak in human and angelic tongues, but do not have love, I am a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have the gift of prophecy and comprehend all mysteries and all knowledge, if I have all faith so as to move mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give away everything I own, and if I hand over my body so that I may boast but do not have love, I gain nothing. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not jealous. Love is not pompous. It is not inflated. It is not rude. It does not seek its own interests. It is not quick-tempered. It does not brood over injury. It does not rejoice over wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. So faith, hope, and love remain, but the greatest of these is love. Thank you so much.